From Russia with hate, the new militant threat against Moscow and how it exports terror around the world. I'm Martin Stanford. This is Insight. Welcome to Insight. Russia is facing a substantial terror threat from within its own borders and from groups that are active in former Soviet states. Investigators say the attack in the metro in St. Petersburg earlier this month was carried out by a man from Kyrgyzstan, the latest in a series of incidents that have been linked to Daesh. It represents both a new threat to Moscow and one which has deep roots in the country's history, going back to the time of Stalin. Insight senior correspondent Dana Lewis reports.
When a Russian national detonated a bomb on a subway train in St. Petersburg this month, Russian President Vladimir Putin pledged a thorough investigation. Putin came to power promising to protect Russians from terror. In 1999, he used 4 apartment bombings in Russia, which killed 300 people, as a pretext for reinvading the Russian Republic of Chechnya.
Трудно назвать этих людей людьми. Их даже зверями назвать нельзя. Если это звери, то бешеные.
As that brutal war raged on, Putin talked of tracking down and killing terrorists even in their outhouses, he said. Even though later Putin's intelligence service, the FSB, was accused by some of orchestrating the bombings and Putin's war on terror. What was a largely nationalistic separatist movement in Chechnya has through the years become more radicalized. Nigel Inkster is a former director of operations for Britain's spy agency MI6, and he knows groups linked to terror have, if anything, grown under Putin.
The jihadist ideology, whether as espoused by Al-Qaeda or by Islamic State, has a remarkable capacity to attach itself to a wide variety of situations and grievances, and I think this is what we saw in the case of Chechnya. As the fighting got more intense, as brutalities on both sides increased, so this created fertile circumstances for jihadist ideology to take hold.
Former Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden saw Chechnya as a recruiting platform, and he funneled money and arms to Chechen rebels. The roots of terror spread through the Caucasus region, the mountain range separating the Black and Caspian Seas where Asia and Europe converge. And the terror attacks grew, both in notoriety and brutality. At least a dozen major attacks since 1999. October 2002, Chechen rebels take over a Moscow theater holding 700 hostage. 129 Russians are killed, along with 41 hostage takers. August 2004, 2 Russian passenger jets are blown up by Chechens, killing 90. September 2004, a school in Beslan is stormed by Russian authorities after more than 1,000 children and their families are held hostage for 50 hours. 331 die, most of them children. March 2010, 2 female suicide bombers attacked the Moscow underground, killing 40 people. Former FBI counter-terrorism expert Martin Reardon.
There's a significant terrorism threat in Russia. Outside of a conflict zone, the threat to terrorism is there, probably greater than any other country in the world.
The threat not only to Russia. In April of 2013, 2 Chechen Americans carried out the Boston Marathon bombing, killing 3 people and wounding hundreds. The brothers were from Kyrgyzstan, and one spent time in the Caucasus. Western intelligence agencies have long acknowledged strong links between Chechen fighters and groups like Daesh and Al-Qaeda. In fact, in Afghanistan, Chechen fighters have often been heard on the radios guiding the Taliban in conflict with American troops. The same can be said about Syria. And Russian intelligence agencies have been accused of encouraging fighters from the Caucasus to go elsewhere. As the Sochi Winter Olympics approached, Putin worried about the growing threat from the Caucasus, and so experts say his intelligence chiefs allowed and perhaps even facilitated fighters to leave Russia for Syria. leaders of what is now called the Caucasus Emirate quickly proved themselves on the battlefield. One Russian, known as Abu Omar the Chechen, became a prominent Daesh commander until he was taken out by a U.S. airstrike last year. Experts say Putin has tried to export his problem with terror.
We will never prove it. So whether it is a purposeful attempt to get rid of them or just, a kind of permissive attitude, we don't know. But definitely, Russia is one of main exporters of would-be jihadists.
It wouldn't surprise me at all if the FSB were prepared to do whatever it took to ensure a trouble-free Sochi Olympics. So yes, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the security forces of the Russian Federation have interesting, shall we say, relationships with a fairly wide range of non-state groups.
But Putin's heavy-handed involvement in Syria and his support of the Shiite regime of Bashar al-Assad has made Russia an even bigger target of Daesh. In 2015, Daesh claimed responsibility for the bombing of a Russian aircraft in Egypt's Sinai. Russia has a long and dark history with the Caucasus. In the mid-1940s, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin deported 500,000 Chechens and other Caucasus minorities to Siberian gulags, but also to Russia's so-called underbelly in Central Asia. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and the other former Soviet republics are still home to many ethnic Chechens. The attacker of an Istanbul nightclub on New Year's came from Uzbekistan. The April attack in Stockholm by someone driving a truck into a crowd was also a man from Uzbekistan who supported Daesh. And the bomber in the recent St. Petersburg attack had roots in Kyrgyzstan.
That counterterrorism aspect, and that's what's coming back to bite Russia right now. Putin can put thousands of troops in the Caucasus to control the insurgency and go after them. But once you go underground, it becomes a counterterrorism campaign, much harder to fight.
They know that they can't just kill or arrest this, their way out of this problem. And they're busy thinking hard about how to deal with it. I think for the Russian Federation, I think it is still more a case of thinking that they can kill or arrest their way out of the problem.
From radicalization in Central Asia to the problem of returning Chechen fighters from Syria, the threat of terror is growing in Russia, and Putin may not be ready for what is still to come. I'm Dana Lewis, reporting for Insight.
Well, to discuss that further, I'm joined in the studio by Domitila Sagramozo, who's a lecturer in security and development, specialising in security in Russia at King's College in London. And also with us in the studio is the former Kremlin advisor, Alexander Nekrasov. Alexander, do you think that Mr. Putin and the Russian state is making matters worse by being unnecessarily harsh in some parts of its territory?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, the problem of terrorism goes way beyond Russia by now. I think the Western world, and I'm talking about Europe and America, have a huge problem on their hands with this influx of refugees. Amongst these people, obviously there are Daesh fighters who are returning back from Syria and Iraq. I think the crisis in Libya has created such a problem for Europe and America when there are people, filtering through and going into Europe, that to talk about Russia being the main problem at the moment for terrorism in the world, I would think we're just missing the point here.
I don't think that's not quite what we're saying here. We're saying there is a problem and that the central government's attitude to the Caucasus and some of the Central Asian states is maybe making the problem worse.
Well, I would like to remind the viewers that when the first Chechen war broke out, and these rebels in Chechnya were supported by the outside world, including America, by the way, and Western countries, the Russians were appealing to the West and to the world and saying, you are creating a monster that will come back to bite you. But this didn't work. We witnessed a flow of arms, a flow of weapons, money, training outside in the Middle East of these rebels. So the problem started to grow. Maybe it started in Russia, but it grew into an international issue in those years.
Absolutely, and it's very multi-layered and very complex. Just take us back to that Chechen conflict, if you like. Well, that was about a wish for independence, wasn't it, to begin with?
Yes, initially it was a desire for independence, but during the fight, the first war in 1994 to 1996, there was a very strong radicalization of many fighters. And the interwar period between 1996 and 1999, so really a very strong influx of radical jihadist ideas, not only from abroad, but also from the neighboring regions like Dagestan. So that we really
People were attracted into that conflict,
yes,
were they? Yes.
And we saw a radicalization not just of Chechnya, but the entire North Caucasus, from Dagestan on the Caspian all the way to the Black Sea, sometimes even in areas like Karachevo-Cherkessia. But this area has been more or less pacified. The problem, I think, today is not necessarily the North Caucasus. It is primarily the situation in Syria and Iraq, and sort of the very harsh policies of the Russian government in support of Syria and the Iranians to try to bring an end to the war.
So just lead us through that. Why, when Russia sided with President Bashar al-Assad to try and win the war for him, has that caused so much problem?
It has created a problem on the ground because it has radicalized many fighters, but it's also created among the Muslim Sunnis worldwide, especially in areas like Central Asia, a sense of revenge, a sense of vengeance, and a desire to somehow, pay back. Putin has been on the side, sort of seen as an enemy by many of these jihadist groups, even before the Russians effectively intervened, because before they were providing a lot of support through weaponry and logistic support to the Syrian regime. So already in 2012, 2013, Russia was seen as a potential enemy, and there were many threats that were made. And the intervention, to a certain extent, could have exacerbated it. I mean, we might disagree on that, but this is, I think, a dynamic. There is also a regional dynamic about Central Asia. Many of these people live in very dire conditions. Many migrate to Russia. They don't have any prospects. The repressions on Islam in Central Asia by the Central Asian regimes, and this has nothing to do necessarily with Russia, although these regimes and these countries are strongly allied to Russia. They're very strong in their repression of Islam. So that creates also maybe one of the reasons why many of these people are, on the one hand, migrating towards Russia. Many are migrating to Turkey and then try to find a way to Syria to maybe make sense of their lives. Maybe there are a variety of reasons why personally they might be attracted to go to Syria. I think the numbers are being reduced now. When Daesh was very strong, there was a very strong sense that an Islamic State was being built, and that attracted many from the North Caucasus and also from Central Asia. Yeah. But I think the dynamics are different now.
And we have seen the numbers flow down. I think even the North African component agree the traffic to join Daesh in whatever it's doing in Iraq and Syria has changed. So is it fair to say or accuse Russian government and Mr. Putin of a sort of religious component to this? Is he trying to suppress the life chances of those who follow the Muslim faith, wherever they may live?
Well, I personally don't see any repressions against Muslims on Russian soil, on the Russian territory. I think we are missing some important components of why this problem has arisen across the Central Asian, for example, republics. Don't forget Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan. Yeah. I'm talking about the American invasion. Now, this spread of jihadists across Central Asia was contributed by this occupation of Americans. The war was a disaster. NATO is keeping quiet about it, but this was a disastrous war, which, by the way, increased the production of opium in Afghanistan, with the money being used to fund some of the most radical groups which have infiltrated to the Central Asian republics and are now infiltrating Russia. That problem has never been raised in the past, I mean, recently. Also, when we talk about Syria, look, Russia has been standing aside when Iraq was invaded. Russia did not do anything when Libya was attacked and destroyed, right? So it had to intervene in Syria because we would have had another Libya, which personally, I can't understand why people are saying, well, Russia is, supporting Assad. It's supporting a government which is still in place, whatever you think about this government.
Yeah,
if you take this government away, you will have another Libya, and you would have a disaster even on the borders of Israel.
But I mean, look, many would say that there isn't really a government in place in large parts of Syria. But should we just pause our conversation there and come back? I want to ask you in a moment about the prospect of a young person growing up in one of those Central Asian republics who is facing no job prospects at all, and why they might go off to a Russian city in search of work and what happens then. We'll continue the conversation in just a moment.